Quick announcement before we get into the Perseverance podcast. This is Kelvin, and I want to just give you a quick notice on the See Me Cane, and where we are with that is that I need your help to be able to help me fundraise the Lighted Blind Cane. So please go ahead and do seemecane.com and let's make this happen. So what is the See Me Cane? It's a lighted blind cane allowing blind individuals from seeing from 100 yards away. So let's do this, and I want to see you at seemecane.com and let's back this project. So here's the Perseverance podcast. Hey, welcome to the Perseverance podcast. My name is Kelvin, known as the Deaf Blind Potter. It's so good to see you, even though I can't see you. It's another beautiful day in the neighborhood. And I got an interview for you. We're going to talk about sex. How does that have to relate to the Perseverance podcast? With this interview, you'll find out that part of your persevering and finding joy in your pain is being able to talk about it and be able to work through the pain that comes along with it. Because once you find joy in that pain and you start persevering, you start building a character that has hope. And that hope comes in Christ. But you have to put in the work. Because this type of addiction can destroy your life. It can destroy your home. It can destroy your child who might be addicted to it as well. And that's where we're going to be kind of spending a lot of time today. So, you guys ready for this? This is going to be a tough topic, but don't stop here. Let's persevere through this topic today. Persevering is what can allow you to overcome. But you have to find joy in the pain that you live with. It's not going to be easy, but the reward and the character that you will build in persevering through your challenges will be so rewarding. It will give you so much hope. Are you ready to persevere through your challenges? Let's do this. Hey, John Fort, welcome to the Perseverance podcast. Thank you for being here.
It's good to be here.
First question right off the bat is, what is your story? And tell us, how did you get into this ministry and educating parents and supporting families in sex addiction?
Well, I'll tell you what, it didn't happen that when I was a kid, I dreamed of growing up and working in the area of sex addiction. That's for sure. All of us who work in this realm have really bad stories. In other words, something about sexuality really messed us up when we were younger. And then that got turned around, and we want other people to experience the same freedom we have now. And so for me is when I was 4 or 5 years old, a neighbor boy started sexually abusing me. And so that's where mine started. Now, I didn't think of it as abuse. I didn't know what it was. My dad was a pastor, but the church that he was pastoring at was tiny and couldn't afford to pay him. So he also had another full-time job. So he kind of had 2 jobs. And I very rarely saw him. And we lived on a farm way out in the middle of nowhere. And there was just nothing to do. And I was really bored and really needing male attention, if that made sense. Well, the only person living anywhere near us was the neighbors. And they had a boy who was like 13 years old. And he started abusing me. But at the time, that felt like positive attention to me. It's like somebody was paying attention to me. But also, what I didn't understand is that it sexualized me to where I started thinking everything seemed sexual. Then when I was 9, we moved, and then another person about the same age, about 15, 16, by that time, just started doing the same kind of thing with me again. And I can't remember if he showed me pornography or I was out at a sleepover with a couple friends, one of which was only 8, and he had just found his dad's pornography stash, and it was enormous. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of magazines. And so we stayed up all night looking at that. And this stuff kind of all together, just everything in my life was sexualized, if that made sense. Kind of like kids today, where whether they're looking at porn or not, everything they see is sexualized. By the time I was 11 years old, I was out looking for sex from other kids and just wherever I could find it. Hadn't even reached puberty yet. I remember going to church and sitting there feeling so guilty because of the kinds of things I was doing, but then asking God to help me. And I remember being 15 years old. This is kind of an interesting story. And asking God, why won't you help me? I hear people who were drug addicts or alcoholics, and they said they accepted Christ, and then that went away. And I'm like, yeah, but I keep asking you to take this away, and it doesn't go away. I thought either God just really wasn't strong enough, like maybe some things he can't fix, or I'd already disgusted him so much that he didn't want to help me. And so that's kind of where I was left at 15 years old. And I became pretty depressed. And I thought, as I got older, I thought, well, this stuff will all go away when I get married. I got married, and maybe for 3 months it went away. But by that time, it wasn't so much porn. I started seeking out sexual contact. And so that kind of continued until my wife figured it out and said, you have to get help or you have to leave. Right after my daughter was born. So that's kind of the story. That's the rated G version. My sexual acting out was really bad.
How did God help you through that healing process? How did you start persevering to find joy through the pain that you had to go through to build the character that you have today?
There's several pieces to that. The first piece was sitting down with a counselor and having the shame of recounting all this stuff. And then him asking me to go back through my childhood. And he was the one that said, well, you were sexually abused. And I said, no, I wasn't. Remember, most of those situations didn't come across as negative to me. And so I wanted to do these things. It was my fault. I owned all of that. So for him to say you were abused, that took me a while to get through. And the second thing was when I went through all the stuff growing up, which I've left a lot of details out, he said, well, no wonder you turned out this way. It's like, how would anybody not turn out this way with what you've been through? And that was kind of a relief. This is the picture he gave me. Imagine a gemstone. God created you as this gemstone. And then all this gunk and dirt and mud and stuff got stuck to you as you grew up. And yeah, you rolled in the mud sometimes on purpose, right? But that gemstone is still in there. And he goes, recovery, we're just going to peel all this stuff off that's on the outside. The core of who God made you to be has not been damaged. It's still there. And that was a really interesting mental picture for me that really helped me a lot. The other thing that was interesting is that he identified very quickly my biggest problem was I didn't know what to do with emotions. I had shut my feelings off a long time ago. And some of that abuse had actually affected me really negatively. And I'd kind of just blocked those memories, if that made sense. And so my first assignment was working on feelings, keeping journals and writing down, how are you feeling? And I didn't know. I had two feelings. I was numb or angry. That was it. Trying to figure out what I was even feeling, because feelings are dangerous. And so I just turned them all off. And so that first year was really, really hard because of just trying to get in touch with what I was feeling. Then later is, what do I do when I feel alone? I don't have to run away from it. A big part of my work has been emotional resilience. We call it becoming aware of your emotions and then figure out what to do with your emotions and not being afraid of them. So even though I work in the area of sex addiction and helping parents with their kids, the focus of my work is emotions, not sex.
That is so true. Because if I think about my own life and my struggle and the times where I've fallen and got into porn, it's because I felt alone. And I wanted something to satisfy that. Mm-hmm. And granted, in my time, I was just starting to lose my vision. So I also wanted to get as much in before I lost all my vision. Two factors there. I was feeling alone. Would there be any woman that would ever love me? And two, I'm losing my vision. So what do I do with that? And I can clearly remember for me, I was very fortunate. I had a very strong walk with Christ. But once I started going in there, I could just see myself just spiraling into the darkness. And my parents never talked about it. It was something that you knew you didn't do. But what ended up happening is that I ended up starting going to the pit. And thankfully, I had a buddy that was able to say, hey, let's keep each other accountable and let's pull out of this. And we pulled out of it together. I mean, he struggled a little bit more than I did, but we were able to work together and build that accountability. And I was very, very, very fortunate that I didn't get any more addicted than I did, but it's still a daily battle for me, even though I can't see. You don't have to be blind. I mean, you don't have to be able to see to be struggling with the same temptations. You can paint as many beautiful pictures as you like in your brain. And I find that we got to talk about the feelings. And I think that's huge, huge.
What was a revelation to me was to realize that my story, my problems, all of that stuff was really based with the inability to know what to do with feelings. When I talk with parents, which is kind of the main thing I do these days, is I tell them the biggest reason that sexuality gets messed up in kids is when they don't know what to do with their feelings. When some form of sexual stimulation becomes the go-to way to deal with feelings. And that's why it's not about sex, it's about feelings.
So, John, as we've kind of explored your story and we kind of got into the root of it, of feeling the pain and dealing with the feeling to then solve the issue with porn and sex addiction and all of that, kind of guide us as parents, in my case, being a foster dad, as well, parents that are listening to this podcast. How do we start helping our kids talk about the feeling that they're feeling? In my case, I was alone and I was losing my vision. So I was dealing with depression issues with that and then feeling alone. And what got me into porn, how do we start talking about that? How do we start generating that conversation at the dinner table?
Well, ideally, and I know some parents, their kids are already older, but ideally you want to start this when your kids are like 4 or 5. So that's the key. Is my favorite parents to talk to are parents of little kids. And so what we start off with is just basically teaching them a bigger vocabulary. You get what's called a feelings chart, and they're all over the internet, just a bunch of faces that with different expressions, and teach the kids that this feeling is frustrated or lonely or overwhelmed. And you would be really surprised how a little kid, a 4-year-old, can grow their vocabulary beyond what most adults have about feelings. And they can start off by going up to the chart and say, I'm feeling this. When you see your kid dealing with the feeling, you bring them to the chart and say, which one are you feeling right now? So the first is just expanding vocabulary. Then they get older, you want to teach them to recognize what they're feeling. So if a kid is crying, you would not do this when they're crying, but like you sit down and say, okay, so when you cry, what are you usually feeling? So you do this after they've got a bigger vocabulary. Maybe they're disappointed. Maybe they're feeling left out. And then say, what do you really need at that time? Sometimes a kid needs some space when they're being overwhelmed, or sometimes they need a hug. But what this does is when they start to cry or they want to hit their sister or whatever negative behavior comes up, they begin to recognize, oh, I'm probably having this feeling now. And so I know what I want. It gives them some control. When I'm overwhelmed, I can do something besides hit my sister or cry. And my family knows we've talked about this. Parents are going to want to do this too. And so starting that kind of stuff around the dinner table, you can get a feelings chart and bring it to the dinner table, have the youngest person in the family point to a face, and everybody goes around and tells, when's the last time you felt that way? I also tell parents, talking about feelings is the training ground for talking about sex. If you wait till a kid's 12 years old and you've never talked about anything personal, and all of a sudden you want to talk about sex and porn, they're going to freak out. And you're going to freak out. But if you've been talking about feelings since they were 5, you're already used to talking about personal things, and talking about porn and sex is then a small step from that, not a big, huge one. These are some of the kind of ways to start those kinds of conversations.
Let me just throw you for a curveball. So this is for foster parents, because I do have some foster parents that do listen and follow me. And they come to you 9, 8, 10 years old. If we look at the psychology part of the brain and all that stuff, they didn't get a lot of the early childhood development skills. So do you think pictures and everything, like we're talking about emotional pictures for like 11, 12, or 13-year-old, is still a good strategy to start building those early childhood development skills, to start talking about that feeling? Obviously, it's going to be a long road before we can start getting into nitty gritties and building that comfort zone.
Everything I'm talking about, you could do with any age. A lot of time we'll get a call from a parent and they've got a 16-year-old who's like binging on porn and hiding it from them, and they're trying to talk and they don't know what to do. And then I say, do you talk with them about feelings? And they say, no. I said, well, I want you to forget talking about porn for a while, and I want you for like 3 months just to talk about feelings. And I give them a bunch of stuff, because you don't dive into the deep end until you learn how to be in the shallow end. And so, yeah, if your kid's older, you still start here and you get to where they're comfortable, whether it's a foster kid or not, to where you're comfortable talking about that. And then you slowly elevate to where then you can start talking about the connection between feelings and temptation to do things that are bad for us.
You're hitting every point that I'm really interested in. Because what I'm finding, being a parent and trying to love this child that has faced tons of trauma, and just trying to get him to talk about his feelings. But I love the idea that we can play games around this. So as we've kind of moved forward, we work with our kids. They're starting to work through their feelings, and we are together as a family working through our feelings. So now they're at that age, or they've been at that age. We've gone 3, 4, 6 months working hard on feelings. Now, how do we start having that conversation about porn and sex? Because it's a taboo topic for a lot of families. If anything, they play around with the topic and never really address it seriously.
I work for Be Broken Ministries, and we deal with these issues. And so we've got a couple of books that help parents with that. We've also got some online courses that are like video based that help through these kind of things too. We have an online course called Family Game Plan for Responding to Porn Use. And that was developed because we kept getting so many calls from parents. So what that one does is the first week is just for parents, because parents, we need to get over our own baggage and get ready so that we don't overreact and get angry and do things that hurt. So we got to get the parents ready first. And then there's 2 weeks or 14 days of very short lessons that are video based. And then it says, now do this. Okay. And so it walks them through talking about feelings all the way to talking about porn. It talks about the harms of porn. They hear other teenagers are in these videos, and then they talk about the feelings and then how to deal with temptation. So all that stuff is in there. We have other books that do the same kind of thing. Just kind of depends on what the family likes better. But basically, the key to it is that parents need to leverage their own story. Once they're used to talking about feelings and personal things, we start by saying, you're to that age when you're going to be exposed to porn. Let me tell you about the first time I was exposed to porn. We did a survey with a bunch of Christian teenagers a couple of years ago, and we asked them, why do you not talk to your parents about porn? And it was anonymous, so they couldn't see what anybody else was writing. All of the teenagers said only one of two things. My parents won't understand how I feel, or I'll get in trouble for what I say, or even for what I ask. The kids basically think that parents don't understand what this is like, which we do. And so the way to help both of those things is we go first. What I tell parents is every discussion you have, you always go first. Whatever you want your kid to tell you, you tell first. And of course, parents are afraid that their kids won't respect them if they learn their past. But the fact of the matter is, over and over and over again, teenagers tell my own kids were this way too. They respect us more when we're honest about our past.
I love that idea. I've started implementing it in my home, talking about my pain and my suffering. And right now we're dealing with a lot of behavior issues of him not being able to work with me as a blind person, and he abandoned me at the skate park the other day, just took off. And I left there and didn't know where he was at. Granted, a seeing parent could have the same thing happen too, but in this case, we had to deal with some of that behavior things, and so I had to talk about my feelings and the struggles that I was dealing with. I told him about stories about my childhood, why this isn't a good or bad, or and how to solve that. And so I like this idea is really the parents coming in, being vulnerable, but knowing that it's going to build a foundation in your home to really build that respect with your kids so that they are comfortable talking to you about that pain or that emptiness and that void. And you can have the parent help guide them through that process. I love it. I love it. Where did we get all the videos? What website did we go to again?
The videos are on a website called purelifeacademy.org. And they've got men, women, and family and leaders. And so family is where you go for those. There's also one on just emotional resilience. There's one with a whole bunch of emotional exercises and games and all kinds of stuff to do with different ages of kids. And then the books are on bebroken.com. Bebroken.com under resources has books. And we actually have one that came out last week called Father-Son Accountability. This is a second edition that my son and I wrote. And so we're writing about our conversations, and it's an 8-week thing that you do. Just a little bit of reading every week. You read it with your son.
Yeah, I love it. Because I think that's where you start building that strong relationship with your kids, and you start working through that. So I think that's powerful. That's powerful. So I know my foster son today has been exposed to things that I can't control. So if you could give an advice to me, but as well thinking in terms of other parents, what would be the first 3 steps I need to do to be able to start helping him heal through the process?
Well, before I get to that, I'd say our kids are exposed to things that we don't have control over. That's universal. The first thing is make sure you're talking about feelings for a while so they're used to talking about personal things. I know I'm repeating that over and over again, but it's just not a good idea to dive into super personal things until you've laid that groundwork of we talk about personal things in this family, and it's okay. It's safe to do. They have to experience not being shut off, being allowed to express their feelings without being corrected. That's where they can test to see if it's safe. The second thing I would do is just say, I know that you've probably been exposed to all kinds of stuff, and I wanted us to be able to talk about that. Here's what I was exposed to and how it happened and when and that kind of thing. And not even so much talking about how the damage it did, because I think kids sometimes are more aware of that than we think they are, but just saying it's okay to talk about these things and realize that they may not be quite ready to confess yet. My own son took a month after he was exposed to hardcore porn before he told anybody. Even though we'd already had all these conversations, I'd already told him about how I was first exposed. It took him a month to get the courage up to tell my wife and I what he had done. He saw some and he kept looking at it. So that's another thing, and that has to be okay. And then the third thing, today we've got all these guides and books and things that we talked about that help a parent know what to say, because no one trained us to know how to do this. Most of us, our parents didn't talk about any of this because my dad didn't say anything about this stuff. So we don't know what we're doing. There's a lot of resources out there for this kind of stuff. For little kids, there's books about how to explain body parts and how to explain sex and all that from a Christian perspective, all the way up to talking through these kinds of issues of like what have you been exposed to and talking about that. When your kid is talking about it, and here's the key is say, I'm so glad you told me, or you're not in trouble, because they may be worried that I'm telling you something I did. And this can be hard for parents. We think we have to punish them so they won't do it again. If your kid confesses something and you punish them, they will never tell you anything again. This is one area where punishment is not the right parental response. And if in the past we've acted in anger, like we caught our kid looking at porn and we got mad, then we go back and we say, I shouldn't have reacted that way. Usually we're mad at ourselves. I said, I was really mad at myself for not doing a good enough job to protect you from this stuff. Because that's usually the truth. So even if parents have blown it and done all the wrong things, we can apologize and say, I want to start over with this. Those are some things I can think of.
I love doing steps, like one step at a time. You work on this and you start breaking down those walls, and then start the next process, and you start the next. And I think that makes it so helpful to understand, all right, this isn't going to be something that's going to be fixed tomorrow. This is something that requires, again, the word perseverance. We have to find joy in our pain to persevere, to build a character that has hope in Christ. I kind of want to bring this forward to when you told your story. Can you tell us now, where are you at today, and how has God helped you through this healing process? You just talked about your son. You and your son are working together through this journey. How has your marriage become stronger through this journey today?
So first of all, I do want to say that not all stories have a happy ending. Sometimes marriages do end in situations like this. And so I want to be sensitive to those listeners who may be listening and thinking, well, my marriage is already over. And there were some negative things. My own siblings have pretty much disowned me through all this stuff. You don't always get to restore every relationship when we've had particularly bad behavior on our part. But as for my marriage, somehow that survived and thrived. But that was my wife's choice, was to give this another shot. So that doesn't always work that way. I had no choice in that. But we have worked through this. I went through a lot of therapy. My wife went through therapy and support groups so that she would know how to respond to me and what helps and what doesn't help. And then we were always honest with our kids. As soon as they were old enough to even barely understand, they knew everything that was going on. I mean, they knew everything. And so that's another thing is people say, well, my kid's not old enough to know. They are old enough to know. But what's happened is through talking about this with feelings and stuff, I have a daughter as well. We are really, really close. My kids are adults now. I see my kids at least once a week because they want to get together. And we are the safest people in their life to talk to. And how many parents can say that? My son is married now and has a grandson. So that's, to me, my grandson is just evidence. My son was actually not born until after I'd already started recovery and been in recovery for a few years. He never knew me as an addict. He never knew what I was like back then. Everyone has temptation. But before, when it was like a constant struggle, I now go 6 or more months without feeling any sexual temptation of any kind. And then when it happens, I know what to do. I have men I reach out to so I don't do something stupid. I remember when my daughter was 13, I was at a Celebrate Recovery thing and they asked me to tell my story. And my daughter walked in and sat on the front row. I told my story and she had a phone. It wasn't a smartphone, but just one that could call and text. And afterwards, she texted me and said, I'm so proud of you.
Wow.
We still talk about everything all the time. My marriage is better than anyone's marriage that I know. Because if you get through this, you can get through anything. It was a ton of work, years and years of work, lots of therapy, lots of support groups. But when you're willing to go through the process, then really great things can happen.
I just love the power of healing. Be able to heal. And you got an amazing wife. My cousin, her husband basically walked away because of his addiction. She had to go through her own healing individually to be able to overcome. At the same time, she was willing to work on it, but he wasn't. I love that your wife was there and she worked through it and you guys were able to persevere and build the beautiful marriage that you guys have. And that's what I think is so powerful about our God. God is the one that gives us the joy when it's hard. And he's the one that helps us persevere and just to keep going forward to build a relationship that we need with him and to continue to fall in love with him. So, John, I really appreciate you being open with us today, telling us about your ministry and how you are helping families and helping them overcome. So before we wrap up, All that information will be in the description down below, so that way you can be able to buy their books or be a part of their curriculum for your kids. And you guys also have women and adult programs, right?
Yeah.
So if you are individually struggling with this as well and want to start persevering through the challenge, this is a good resource. I happen to fall upon this organization by accident. I think it's a godsend that I found you guys, because I'm having to work through this in my own home and leading my home to start talking about our feelings, so that way we can start addressing some of the more deeper issues. And I think it's been the perfect timing. God knows what he's doing. And I always love to see how God comes for us.
We help men, women, and families move from sexual brokenness to wholeness in Christ. That's what we do. So our website is bebroken.com, all one word. And there you'll see men, women, and families right there. And so they have programs for men and programs for wives and programs for kids. We don't ourselves do women who struggle, but when people call us, we have partners that we refer them to, just because we just don't have anyone on staff to do that. If you go to bebroken.com and go to more and resources and books, the 2 books are Honest Talk, a new perspective to talking to your kids about sex, and then Father-Son Accountability. The new version just came out a week ago. That's for dads and boys 12 and up. We have a ton of other stuff that you'll see on there. We do a father-son webinar where we walk fathers and sons through their first conversation live. Then our other website is purelifeacademy.org. That's our online training portal. And so again, we have courses for men, courses for women. There we do have courses for women who struggle, and for wives, and then for families, and then for leaders too. And so in the families, the 2 courses are emotional resilience, and then a family game plan for responding to porn use.
Awesome. John, it's been a pleasure. And I am so thankful that God brought you into my life so that we can have this conversation, this taboo conversation that nobody really wants to talk about. But we're able to find joy in this, to persevere and build a character and hope. So, John, appreciate it, you being here, and thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Here's the Perseverance Corner. Therefore, we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. Let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so eagerly entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race that is marked out. This is from Hebrews 12:1. I want you guys to understand, as you run your race of perseverance, we need to take good, careful look at the sin that is around us. And is this of God? Is this what God wants us to do? Because if we put things in our lives that are not what God wants us to do, then it's going to hinder us from being able to persevere through our challenge. Here comes the announcements. So here's the announcement for this month, coming up month, is that we are doing a lot of new things. There's a lot of prayer that needs to be done. Like, I need prayer over my foster son. I need Roberta, my assistant. She needs prayer right now. There's a guy that I'm working with who just had a brain injury. And I just want to give a shout out to Spencer, because I know he's going to be listening to this podcast. I want you to know the whole Perseverance podcast is going to be praying for you as you heal through your brain injury and through the challenges that you're dealing with your vision. And I'm excited to see how God's going to use you as you go through this journey. Also, if you need prayer, I want you to email me at kelvin@perseverancepodcast.com. I check my emails every day, and I respond to them pretty promptly. And I'll be happy to pray for you. If you need to get in contact with somebody to help you through a journey, I can definitely point you in the right direction. So, also, Perseverance Podcast is starting to grow. It's starting to become more of a flow, which also going to be next year. We're going to be adding a new segment to the Perseverance Podcast, and that is Perseverance Through the Bible. So we're going to go through characters through the Bible, and those characters we're going to see from the lens of perseverance, How does Moses? How does Adam? How does Noah? How does David? How does Saul? How do Jesus? How does Peter? How does Paul? How does John? How does Elijah? How does Jacob? All those people that I just named, there's a ton of people in the Bible that have persevered, and we're going to look at them individually, and we're going to talk about their struggles and see how it relates to us. And lastly, if you want to support the Perseverance podcast, go to deafblindpotter.com and buy some merch, buy pottery, all those things that help support the Perseverance podcast, and it helps me continue to be able to keep the lights on, aka the server on all those things, so that you can get the Perseverance podcast in a timely manner. Like I always say, to wrap up this podcast, go live beyond your challenges. Now you're ready to persevere for your challenges today. Thank you for joining me on the Perseverance Podcast. If you'd like to get a hold of me, you can email me at kelvin@perseverancepodcast.com. You can also follow me on TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Deaf Blind Potter. If you'd like to buy some merch or some Deaf Blind Potter pieces, you can go to deafblindpotter.com. Please give us a 5-star rating and subscribe to the Perseverance Podcast so you don't miss an episode. That way, you and I can continue living beyond our challenges and persevering through them too.